The Caylee Anthony case, most hated mother in America. Imagine your 2-year-old daughter goes missing, and instead of calling the police, you go out partying, getting tattoos, and living your best life for 31 days. Sounds impossible, right? Well, that's exactly what happened in one of the most shocking and controversial criminal cases in American history. This is the story of Caylee Anthony, a beautiful toddler whose death would expose the dark truth about her mother Casey and ultimately divide an entire nation over what justice really means. Caylee Marie Anthony was everything you'd expect from a precious 2-year-old girl. With her bright blonde hair, sparkling eyes, and infectious smile, she was the kind of child who could light up any room she entered. Born on August 9th, 2005, Caylee lived with her mother Caylee Anthony and her maternal grandparents, George and Cindy Anthony, in their family home in Orlando, Florida. To the outside world, they appeared to be a loving, close-knit family, doing their best to raise this adorable little girl together. But beneath the surface, serious cracks were already beginning to show. Caylee Anthony, just 19 when Caylee was born, had never truly embraced motherhood. While her parents doted on their granddaughter and took on much of the responsibility for Caylee's care, Casey seemed more interested in maintaining her social life, going out with friends, and acting like the carefree teenager she still was at heart. This dynamic created constant tension within the household, with Cindy frequently having to step in as the primary caregiver while Casey came and went as she pleased. The last confirmed sighting of Caylee alive was on June 16th, 2008, when she was seen leaving her grandparents' house with her mother. What happened next would become the subject of countless theories, investigations, and heated debates that continue to this day. But what we know for certain is that for the next 31 days, while her daughter was supposedly missing, Caylee Anthony lived a life that would shock and horrify the American public. Instead of reporting her daughter missing, Casey went on what can only be described as a party marathon. She was seen at nightclubs dancing and drinking, staying overnight at her boyfriend Tony Lazaro's apartment, and generally acting like a woman without a care in the world. During this time, she told elaborate lies to anyone who asked about Caylee's whereabouts. She claimed her daughter was with a nanny named Zenaida Gonzalez, or that she was visiting relatives, or that she was at various other locations with different people. Each story was more creative than the last, but they all had one thing in common: none of them were true. Perhaps most disturbing of all, during this 31-day period, Casey got a tattoo on her shoulder that read Bella Vita, which means beautiful life in Italian. The timing of this tattoo would later become a crucial piece of evidence that prosecutors would use to argue that Casey knew her daughter was dead and was celebrating her newfound freedom. Meanwhile, Casey's parents were growing increasingly concerned about their granddaughter's absence. Cindy Anthony had been calling and texting her daughter repeatedly, demanding to know where Caylee was and when she could see her. Casey's responses were always evasive, filled with excuses about why visits weren't possible and promises that they would see Caylee soon. But as the days stretched on, Cindy's maternal instincts told her something was seriously wrong. The breaking point came on July 15th, 2008, when Cindy Anthony finally had enough. After weeks of being given the runaround by her daughter, she drove to Tony Lazaro's apartment and confronted Casey directly. What she found there would change everything. Casey's car, which had been impounded, smelled strongly of what Cindy would later describe as the unmistakable odor of human decomposition. When she demanded to know where Caylee was, Casey finally broke down and admitted that her daughter had been kidnapped by the nanny, Zenaida Gonzalez. That night, Cindy Anthony made 3 frantic 911 calls to police. In the most famous of these calls, which would be played countless times during the eventual trial, Cindy can be heard saying, "I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." Her voice, filled with panic and desperation, captured the horror of a grandmother who was beginning to realize the unthinkable might have happened to her beloved granddaughter. When police arrived to question Caylee, her behavior was immediately concerning to investigators. She appeared calm, almost detached as she repeated her story about the kidnapping. She claimed that Zenaida Gonzalez, a nanny she had been using for months, had taken Caylee from a park and disappeared. But when pressed for details, Caylee's story began to fall apart. She couldn't provide Zenaida's address, phone number, or any way to contact her. She claimed to have searched for her daughter on her own, but couldn't explain why she hadn't called police immediately. As the investigation progressed, detectives quickly discovered that virtually everything Caylee had told them was a lie. There was no nanny named Zenaida Gonzalez. The addresses Caylee provided didn't exist or belong to people who had never heard of her. Her supposed job at Universal Studios was fiction. Her claims about searching for Caylee were completely fabricated. In fact, investigators found that during the time Caylee claimed to be desperately looking for her missing daughter, she had been living a completely normal social life, never once appearing distressed or concerned about Caylee's welfare. The search for Caylee became a massive media sensation, with volunteers joining law enforcement in scouring Central Florida for any sign of the missing toddler. Nancy Grace, the famous television host, covered the case obsessively, referring to Caylee as "tot mom" and expressing outrage at her behavior. The case captured the attention of millions of Americans who were horrified by the idea that a mother could go 31 days without reporting her child missing. On December 11, 2008, the worst fears were confirmed. A utility worker found a small skull in a wooded area less than half a mile from the Anthony family home. The remains were soon identified as those of Caylee Anthony. The little girl had been found in a laundry bag, wrapped in a blanket, with duct tape covering her mouth and nose. She had been dead for months, her tiny body decomposing in the Florida swampland while her mother partied and lied to everyone around her. The discovery of Caylee's remains transformed the case from a missing child investigation into a murder case, with Caylee Anthony as the prime suspect. Prosecutors argued that Caylee had killed her daughter because she saw Caylee as an obstacle to the carefree lifestyle she wanted to live. They painted a picture of a selfish, narcissistic young woman who was willing to murder her own child rather than accept the responsibilities of motherhood. The prosecution's case seemed overwhelming. They had Caylee's 31 days of lies, her behavior during that time, the smell of decomposition in her car, and the fact that she had shown no genuine emotion or concern about her daughter's disappearance. Internet searches on the family computer revealed that someone had looked up information about chloroform and neck-breaking techniques. Caylee had even told friends that Caylee was holding her back from living her life to the fullest. But Caylee's defense team, led by attorney Jose Baez, had a different story to tell. They argued that Caylee had accidentally drowned in the family swimming pool, and that Caylee and her father George had panicked and covered up the death. They claimed that Caylee had been sexually abused by her father throughout her childhood, which had taught her to lie and cover up traumatic events as a survival mechanism. According to the defense, Caylee's behavior during those 31 days was the result of psychological trauma, not guilt over murder. The trial began on May 24, 2011, and immediately became a media circus. Court TV provided gavel-to-gavel coverage, and millions of Americans tuned in daily to watch the proceedings. The case divided public opinion like few others in recent memory. On one side were those who saw Caylee as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered her innocent daughter for selfish reasons. On the other side were those who believed she might be a victim of abuse who had made terrible decisions in a moment of panic. The prosecution presented their case methodically, walking jurors through Caylee's lies, her behavior during the 31 days, and the physical evidence found with Caylee's body. They brought in experts who testified about the smell of human decomposition in Caylee's car and the significance of the duct tape found with the remains. They painted Caylee as a woman who saw her daughter as nothing more than an inconvenience to be eliminated. The defense countered by attacking the quality of the investigation and presenting their drowning theory. They argued that there was no direct evidence linking Caylee to her daughter's death, and that the prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence and speculation. They claimed that the real culprit was George Anthony, who had covered up the accidental drowning to protect himself from liability. Throughout the trial, Caylee's behavior continued to puzzle observers. She showed little emotion during testimony about her daughter's death, often appearing bored or distracted. When photos of Caylee's remains were shown, Caylee looked away but didn't cry. Her lack of visible grief struck many as further evidence of her guilt, though her defenders argued it was consistent with someone who had been traumatized and was dissociating from the proceedings. After more than a month of testimony, the case went to the jury on July 4, 2011. The deliberations lasted less than 11 hours, an unusually short time for such a complex and high-profile case. When the jury returned with their verdict on July 5th, the entire country was watching. The foreman stood and delivered verdicts that shocked the nation. Not guilty of first-degree murder. Not guilty of aggravated child abuse. Not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child. Caylee Anthony was found guilty only on 4 counts of lying to police officers. The courtroom erupted, spectators gasped, and across America, millions of viewers couldn't believe what they had just heard. The reaction was immediate and intense. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse chanting "Justice for Caylee" and expressing their outrage at the verdict. Social media exploded with anger and disbelief. Many Americans felt that a guilty woman had literally gotten away with murder, and Caylee Anthony instantly became one of the most hated people in the country. The jurors later explained that while they believed Caylee was probably responsible for her daughter's death, the prosecution had not proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. They found the evidence circumstantial and felt that too many questions remained unanswered. Some jurors admitted they were physically sick about having to acquit Caylee, but said they had to follow the law rather than their emotions. Caylee was sentenced to 4 years in prison for the lying charges, but was released just days after the verdict due to time already served and good behavior credits. Her release was conducted in secret due to safety concerns, as death threats had been pouring in from across the country. The aftermath of the Caylee Anthony case has been long-lasting and complex. Caylee Anthony became a pariah, unable to live anything resembling a normal life due to the intense public hatred directed toward her. She has largely stayed out of the public eye, giving only a few interviews in which she has maintained her innocence while offering different versions of what happened to her daughter. The case sparked nationwide discussions about the American justice system, the role of media in high-profile trials, and what constitutes reasonable doubt. Legal experts remain divided on whether the jury made the right decision, with some praising them for following the law despite public pressure, while others argue that common sense and the totality of evidence clearly pointed to Caylee's guilt. For the Anthony family, the case destroyed relationships and left deep, permanent scars. George and Cindy Anthony lost both their granddaughter and their daughter in different ways. They have continued to honor Caylee's memory, while struggling with the public attention and the unanswered questions that remain about that tragic summer of 2008. Today, more than a decade later, the Caylee Anthony case remains one of the most controversial and discussed criminal cases in American history. It serves as a reminder of how justice and public opinion don't always align, and how the legal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt can sometimes lead to results that much of society finds unacceptable. Whether Caylee Anthony is guilty or innocent, the case will forever be remembered as the moment when America met the woman who would become known as the most hated mother in the country.